In the summer of 1940, Britain stood closer to defeat than at any other moment in its long history. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler's war machine had crushed Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France with terrifying speed. Now only one enemy remained between Nazi Germany and total domination of Western Europe, Great Britain. Every night, German bombers crossed the Channel. Every day, British pilots climbed into their fighters, knowing that the fate of their nation rested on what would happen in the sky. This was the Battle of Britain, and Britain was running out of time. The Royal Air Force had two excellent fighters, the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. Both were agile, fast, and deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. But there was a problem no bravery could solve. They were not being built fast enough. Aircraft were lost daily, pilots were killed or wounded, and factories struggled to replace them. If the Luftwaffe could destroy the RAF, a German invasion would follow. Britain needed airplanes, and it needed them immediately. One solution was unthinkable only months earlier, turning to the United States. America was still officially neutral, and much of the population wanted no part in another European war. But British purchasing missions quietly crossed the Atlantic, searching for any aircraft that could help hold the line. That search led them to a California company called North American Aviation. At first, the British approached North American with a simple request: build the Curtiss P-40 fighter under license. The P-40 was already in service and could be produced quickly. But North American's leadership made a bold counteroffer. Instead of copying an existing design, they proposed something far more ambitious: a completely new fighter, designed from the ground up, optimized for speed, range, and modern air combat. The British were skeptical. They did not have time for experiments, but they were also desperate. They agreed, on one condition: the aircraft had to be ready fast. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the war. From the first line drawn on the drafting table to a completed airframe rolling out of the factory, only 117 days passed. In just under 4 months, North American Aviation delivered a sleek, streamlined fighter unlike anything the RAF had seen before. It was long-nosed, clean, and aerodynamic, built around a revolutionary laminar flow wing designed to reduce drag at high speed. During early test flights, the new aircraft reached 382 miles per hour, faster than many frontline fighters of the time, and it did so while carrying nearly twice as much fuel as the Spitfire. That fuel mattered. Range mattered. This airplane could fly far. The British gave it a name that reflected both its power and its spirit: Mustang, after the wild horse of the American plains. At low altitudes, the Mustang was superb. It was fast, stable, and responsive, with excellent visibility and long endurance. For ground attack missions, reconnaissance, and low-level strikes across the English Channel, it was nearly ideal. RAF pilots quickly grew to respect it, and German troops in occupied France learned to fear it. But the Mustang was not perfect. Its engine, the American-built Allison V1710, performed well at low altitude, but struggled higher up. As the aircraft climbed above 15,000 feet, the engine lost power. Reaching 20,000 feet took almost twice as long as a Spitfire. In a war increasingly fought at high altitude, this was a serious limitation. As a result, the Mustang entered service not as a high-altitude interceptor, but as a fast, long-range tactical aircraft. It strafed rail yards, attacked airfields, and carried out dangerous reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory. In these roles, it proved tough, fast, and reliable. Ironically, the aircraft that would later become the most famous American fighter of the war was, at this point, largely ignored by the United States. The U.S. Army Air Corps showed little interest. America was still at peace, and its military planners saw no urgent need for a long-range escort fighter. The Mustang was viewed as a British airplane, useful perhaps, but not revolutionary. History, however, had other plans. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Within days, the United States was at war. Almost overnight, America's priorities changed. Defeating Nazi Germany became the first and most urgent objective. Soon, thousands of young American airmen arrived in Britain. They were confident, eager, and often untested. They believed in their machines, in their training, and in the idea that technology and courage could win any battle. What they did not yet understand was that the air war over Europe would demand something no American fighter could yet deliver: the ability to fly deep into Germany, stay with the bombers, and fight all the way to the target and back. At that moment, the answer already existed, quietly, almost forgotten, sitting on British airfields under a name few Americans truly appreciated. The Mustang had been born out of desperation. Soon, it would be reborn as the aircraft that would change the war in the sky forever. America entered the war with confidence and with a theory. The leaders of the U.S. Army Air Forces believed they had found a clean, decisive way to defeat Nazi Germany from the air. It was called daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British, who bombed by night to reduce losses, American planners insisted that heavily armed bombers flying in tight formations could defend themselves in daylight. Massed machine guns, overlapping fields of fire, and disciplined crews, they believed, would break any fighter attack. It was an elegant idea. It was also dangerously wrong. By 1942, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were streaming out of airfields across eastern England, climbing into the cold, thin air and setting course for the industrial heart of Germany. Each bomber carried 10 men. Each mission carried enormous risk, but at first, optimism prevailed. Crews trusted their aircraft. Commanders trusted their doctrine. Losses, they believed, would remain acceptable. Reality arrived swiftly and brutally. German fighter pilots were not intimidated by the bombers' guns. They were experienced, aggressive, and highly coordinated. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from head-on, from above, and from behind, firing cannons that tore bombers apart in seconds. Anti-aircraft fire, flak, filled the sky around key targets, forcing bomber formations to fly straight and level through exploding steel. What the bombers needed was obvious: fighter escort. The United States did have fighters in Europe. The most powerful was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive 8-ton aircraft built around the largest piston engine ever installed in a fighter. At high altitude, it was fast, rugged, and heavily armed. It could absorb astonishing damage and still bring its pilot home. But the Thunderbolt had a fatal flaw. Its enormous engine consumed fuel at an extraordinary rate, more than a gallon every 30 seconds. Even with external drop tanks, the P-47 could escort bombers only part of the way. About 200 miles from base, sometimes a little more, the fighters were forced to turn back. The German pilots knew this. They watched. They waited. As American escorts peeled away and headed home, the Luftwaffe pounced. Bomber crews could often see it happening, their protection vanishing just as enemy fighters closed in. Radios filled with desperate calls. Gunners watched helplessly as aircraft beside them exploded, disintegrated, or slipped away, trailing smoke and fire. For the men inside the bombers, it was terror without defense. The illusion shattered completely in 1943. On August 17th, American forces launched deep penetration raids against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft plants at Regensburg. These targets were vital to German industry, and they lay far beyond the reach of escort fighters. The bombers went in alone. 60 aircraft were lost in a single day. 600 men, dead, wounded, or captured. It was not an exception. It was a warning. In October 1943, the losses became catastrophic. In just 1 week, 148 bombers failed to return. Nearly 1,500 airmen were gone. Some were shot down in flames. Some parachuted into captivity. Some vanished without witnesses, leaving families to wait for answers that would never come. Crews began to calculate odds, not of success, but of survival. The bombing campaign was unsustainable. No nation, no matter how industrially powerful, could afford losses like these. Without a fighter that could stay with the bombers to the target and back, the entire American air strategy was doomed. And yet, within the Allied air forces, a small number of officers and engineers remembered an aircraft that had been quietly proving itself since 1941. It had range, it had speed, it had firepower. It simply lacked one thing: the ability to fight where this war was truly being decided, high above Germany. The Mustang, born in desperation and nearly overlooked, was about to be given a second chance. The solution to America's greatest air war problem did not come from a new aircraft factory or a bold new design. It came from a quiet engineering decision and from cooperation between two nations fighting for survival. By late 1942, a few perceptive officers within the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces had reached the same conclusion. The Mustang already had everything the war demanded: speed, range, stability, firepower. What it lacked was not airframe or aerodynamics, but altitude performance. The problem was the engine. The Allison V-1710 was a fine power plant at low and medium heights, but modern air combat over Europe took place far higher. Bomber formations cruised above 25,000 feet, where German fighters could attack with advantage. At those altitudes, the Allison simply could not deliver the power needed. The Mustang was being held back by the very heart that drove it. In Britain, engineers at Rolls-Royce had already solved this problem, not in theory, but in combat. Their answer was the Merlin engine. The Merlin powered the Spitfire and Hurricane during the Battle of Britain. It was compact, reliable, and, most importantly, equipped with a highly efficient two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Unlike the Allison, the Merlin did not gasp for air as it climbed. At altitude, it thrived. In 1942, a small team of Rolls-Royce engineers made a bold experiment. They installed a Merlin into a Mustang airframe. The results were nothing short of extraordinary. The modified aircraft climbed faster, flew higher, and gained a dramatic increase in combat performance. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin-powered Mustang produced more power than the Allison engine did at takeoff. Even more impressive, it achieved this while consuming far less fuel than the P-47 Thunderbolt's massive engine. Suddenly, the Mustang was no longer a low-level attacker. It was a high-altitude thoroughbred. Word spread quickly. The Royal Air Force ordered the new version immediately. The U.S. Army Air Forces, facing mounting losses and growing pressure to protect their bomber crews, followed. To ensure mass production, the Merlin would be built in the United States under license by Packard, allowing American factories to produce the engine in enormous numbers without reliance on overseas supply. It was one of the most successful examples of wartime cooperation between Britain and the United States, not driven by pride or rivalry, but by necessity. As production ramped up, the Mustang continued to evolve. The definitive version arrived in the spring of 1944, the P-51D. Its most visible change was the new bubble canopy, replacing the earlier frame design. This gave pilots an unobstructed view in all directions, a critical advantage in air combat. The fuselage was redesigned, The armament standardized to 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and internal fuel capacity increased. With external drop tanks attached, the P-51D could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. No fighter in the world could do that. For the first time, American bomber crews could look up and see friendly fighters still circling overhead as they approached their targets. The psychological effect was immediate. Morale soared. Pilots knew they were no longer alone. For German fighter pilots, the shock was equally profound. The familiar pattern was gone. The American escorts did not turn back. They did not run out of fuel at the critical moment. Instead, they stayed, aggressive, fast, and relentless. They hunted German fighters on the climb, attacked them before they could form up, and followed them all the way back to their airfields. The balance of power in the sky began to shift. Mustang pilots quickly developed a fierce attachment to their aircraft. They spoke of it not as a machine, but as a living thing, responsive, graceful, and powerful. It climbed eagerly, dove like a stone, and turned with precision. Pilots often said that flying it felt instinctive, as though thought alone could move the airplane. It was not invincible. No aircraft ever is. But it gave its pilot something no previous Allied fighter had fully delivered: confidence at any altitude, at any distance, against any opponent. By mid-1944, the Mustang was no longer an experiment or a promising design or a desperate improvisation. It had become the backbone of America's air war over Europe. And with it, the rules of the fight had changed forever. By the time the Mustang became a familiar sight over Germany, the air war had turned into something far more complex than a contest of machines. It was now a battle of endurance, discipline, and nerve, fought by young men who were asked to perform extraordinary acts day after day, knowing that any mission could be their last. A typical escort mission could last 6 hours or more. Mustang pilots climbed into cockpits surrounded by fuel tanks and ammunition, sealed beneath a thin skin of aluminum, barely thicker than a coin. At altitude, the temperature outside dropped to -50 degrees, and the cockpit offered little protection from the cold. Oxygen masks froze, hands went numb, and even simple movements required effort. Below them, the Earth seemed impossibly distant. The isolation was profound. Once airborne, radio silence was often maintained. There was no conversation, no music, no distraction. All a pilot heard was the steady roar of the Merlin engine in front of him, a sound he hoped would continue without interruption for the entire mission. Each pilot was alone, responsible not only for flying the aircraft, but for navigation, fuel management, and combat decisions made in fractions of a second. Fatigue was constant. So was boredom, until suddenly, it wasn't. Without warning, the radio would explode with shouted warnings. German fighters were attacking. In an instant, the long monotony ended. External fuel tanks were dropped, throttles pushed forward, and Mustangs dove toward the bomber formations below. They always attacked. The escort pilots understood their mission clearly: protect the bombers at all costs. Whether outnumbered or not, hesitation meant death, for the men in the bombers and for themselves. Combat unfolded at terrifying speed. At 400 miles an hour, a tenth of a second meant dozens of feet. There was no time to think, only to react. Many victories came without warning. A German pilot focused on the bombers ahead might never know he was under attack until the Mustang's guns tore into his aircraft. Surprise was everything. The ideal kill was the one the enemy never saw coming. But air combat was never clean. Dogfights disintegrated into chaos, twisting, diving, climbing through clouds and sunlight, with aircraft flashing past at closing speeds of hundreds of miles per hour. A moment's hesitation, a single mistake, could be fatal. Some chases ended at low altitude, where there was no room to escape. Pilots knew that if they were hit there, they would not have time to bail out. The psychological toll was immense. Mustang pilots saw bombers explode around them, entire crews lost in seconds. They watched parachutes fail to open. They saw men fall from the sky with no chance of survival. And often, there was nothing they could do but watch. What made it worse was the randomness. A pilot might fly 20 missions without incident, and then be gone on the 21st. In debriefings, there were no answers. Someone who had been laughing in the briefing room that morning simply did not return. To cope, men developed rituals and beliefs. Some were convinced they were destined to survive. Others clung to small routines, a chess game waiting to be finished, a promise made back home. Anything that created the illusion of control in a world ruled by chance. Behind every pilot stood another figure, just as important: the crew chief. On the ground, the aircraft belonged to him. He and his ground crew maintained it, repaired it, armed it, and fueled it. They treated it like a living thing, watching every rivet, listening to every change in engine sound. The relationship between pilot and crew chief was deeply personal, built on trust. A pilot's life quite literally depended on the work done before takeoff. When the pilot climbed aboard and the harness was fastened, ownership changed. The Mustang was no longer the crew chief's aircraft, it was the pilot's. For the next 6 hours, it was his entire world. Many pilots personalized their Mustangs, painting names on the nose, often those of wives or girlfriends waiting thousands of miles away. These small human touches mattered. They reminded the men that there was a life beyond the cockpit, beyond the cold and fear and violence. Day after day, massive formations filled the sky. On the largest missions, more than 1,000 bombers and hundreds of fighters crossed into enemy territory together. The sky turned white with contrails, visible for miles. German gunners and fighter pilots watched from below, preparing to strike. Above the bombers, the Mustangs wove back and forth, scanning constantly. A fighter pilot's most valuable skill was not marksmanship, but awareness, a neck that never stopped turning. When the bombers reached their targets, the escorts could do nothing but watch. Flak was beyond their reach. The bombers flew straight and level, controlled by the bomb aimer, unable to evade. Even the Mustang could not fight exploding steel. Only after the bombs were dropped and the formations turned for home could the escorts relax. Briefly. If ammunition remained, they often attacked targets of opportunity. Airfields, trains, supply convoys. These ground attacks were deadly work. For every Mustang lost in air combat, several more were lost to ground fire. Yet the pressure never stopped. This was the price of air superiority. And the men who paid it would carry those memories for the rest of their lives. By early 1945, the war in the air had reached its final, brutal phase. The change was unmistakable. Where once German fighters had risen in disciplined formations to challenge the bombers, now the skies above Germany belonged to the Allies. The Mustang had not merely shifted the balance, it had broken it. For the Luftwaffe, the situation was becoming desperate. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were rarer still. Experienced pilots, the veterans who had survived Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain, were gone. Many had been killed. Others were worn down by years of combat. In their place came young men with minimal training, rushed into the cockpit with only a handful of hours in high-performance fighters. They were brave, but bravery was no substitute for experience. Against them flew Mustang pilots who had learned the hard way, mission after mission, mistake after mistake, survival bought at a terrible price. The Americans no longer flew defensively. With long-range escort now assured, the mission of the Mustang evolved. Protecting the bombers remained essential, but pilots were also encouraged to seek out and destroy the enemy wherever they could be found. They attacked German fighters as they climbed to intercept, chased them after engagements, and followed them back to their airfields. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war it could not win, not because of courage, but because of exhaustion. The numbers tell part of the story. On January 14, 1945, Mustang units claimed 161 German aircraft destroyed in a single day. 2 days later, more victories followed. And on April 16th, as Allied armies closed in from east and west, more than 700 German aircraft were destroyed, the majority on the ground. Entire airfields were swept clean in minutes. In some attacks, over 80 aircraft were destroyed on a single base before they could even take off. The Luftwaffe was finished. German pilots knew it. Allied pilots knew it. Even Hermann Göring, the commander of Germany's Air Force, understood what had happened. After the war, he admitted that when he saw American fighters over Berlin, fighters that could not possibly have been there before, he knew the war was lost. For Mustang pilots, victory brought no celebration in the moment. They were too tired, too worn, too aware of who was missing. Every squadron had empty bunks. Every briefing room carried the silence of men who would never return. The randomness of survival haunted them. One pilot might fly dozens of missions untouched, while another was lost on his first. There was no logic to it, no fairness. And yet they kept flying. They escorted bombers through flak so dense it looked solid. They watched cities burn beneath them, knowing that factories, rail yards, and fuel depots were being destroyed, and knowing too that civilians were caught in that destruction. Many pilots carried that weight quietly, questioning it only later, when the noise of war had faded. After the bombers turned for home, Mustangs swept low across Germany, attacking anything that moved. Trains, trucks, airfields, and supply columns were all targets. These missions were dangerous, often more dangerous than air combat. Ground fire claimed aircraft daily. A single burst of tracer from the trees could end everything in an instant. Still, the pressure never let up, because air superiority was no longer just about winning battles in the sky. It was about breaking the enemy's ability to fight at all. By spring 1945, Allied ground forces advanced under near-total air cover. Without fighters, German troops were exposed. Movement by day became nearly impossible. Supplies could not reach the front. The war machine that had once seemed unstoppable was now helpless. When the fighting in Europe finally ended, in May 1945, the Mustang's role was not yet finished. It would go on to serve in the Pacific, in post-war air forces, and in conflicts yet to come. But its defining moment, its reason for being, had already passed. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was never just an airplane. It was a companion, a protector, sometimes a savior. They remembered the way the Merlin engine came alive at startup, not as a sound, but as a physical presence you felt in your chest. They remembered the long climb into the morning sun, contrails forming silver roads across the sky. They remembered the silence at altitude, broken only by the engine and their own breathing. And they remembered the fear. Anyone who said he wasn't afraid, they would tell you, was lying. Fear was always there, on the first mission and the last. What mattered was learning to function despite it. Learning to trust your training, your aircraft, and the men flying beside you. Many pilots spent the rest of their lives replaying missions in their dreams, what they could have done differently, where they made mistakes, where they were lucky. Those memories never truly faded. Yet when asked years later whether it had been worth it, their answers were strikingly similar. They believed they had been fighting for something larger than themselves, for democracy, for freedom. for the chance that the world their families lived in would not be ruled by tyranny. They were young, most barely 20 years old, and they were handed one of the finest machines ever built and asked to change the course of history. And they did. The P-51 Mustang did not win the war alone. No single aircraft ever does. But it made victory possible. It stayed when others had to turn back. It followed the enemy home. It took away his last refuge, the sky itself. And in doing so, it earned its place not just in history books, but in the memories of the men who flew it, and in the outcome of the war that defined a generation.